In this segment, we will continue our discussion of the 5 modern models of leadership. This segment will focus on transformational leadership. Transformational leaders influence people toward positive outcomes that represent significant or lasting change. It is one of the most important modern approaches to leadership, and certainly one of the most research-based approaches to leadership. Nelson Mandela and the movie that was made about the 1995 Rugby World Cup team in South Africa is a really good example of a story of transformational leadership and how Mandela served and proved to be a transformational leader. His approach in the movie Invictus, you can see this, changed the perspective of people and their approach to race in South Africa and really led to the transformational change in that country and the abolishment of apartheid. This approach to leadership, as I said, is becoming widely adopted, and it generally you see very positive outcomes for both leaders and followers, and many research studies have supported this as one of the most effective ways to lead an organization. The father of transformational theory is James McGregor Burns, someone you've read and someone we've talked a good bit about. His 1978 book actually titled it Transformational Leadership. This approach from his initial work, and he was more of a political scientist, historian approach, was adopted by many contemporary theorists like Warren Bennis, Kouzes and Posner, and Bernard Bass. We're going to look at the Kouzes, Posner, and Bass model. Bass used what they call the 4 factors or dimensions and behavioral typologies of transformational leaders, and Kouzes and Posner had 5 components of leadership that we'll infuse into our discussion that forms the key concepts of transformational leadership. So the first major concept is this idea of idealized influence. Leaders that are transformational seek to inspire followers and encourage them and motivate them. It is a crucial component of Bass's model. Kouzes and Posner refer to it as modeling the way. This approach depends both on leaders' behavior and on how followers view the leaders. Typically, they view the leader as a role model, as an archetype, really. And so it's a very idealized influence factor. Oftentimes you even hear the word charisma, although we'll talk about the pros and cons of charisma here in a moment. The second major factor is inspirational motivation. Transformational leaders attempt to engage and motivate toward meaningful goals and positive changes. Kouzes and Posner call this inspiring a shared vision. Bass believes that transformational leaders instill in followers a high level of expectations and higher levels of moral purpose. And it's that whole notion of purpose that really distinguishes transformational leadership from a lot of other forms of leadership. And so you can see the importance of goals in the transformational leadership model. The third concept is the idea of intellectual stimulation. Transformational leaders try to engage and challenge followers both emotionally and intellectually, and they tap into the intellect through creative ideas, innovation. Kouzes and Posner call it challenging the process. It's the idea that leaders are good, transformational leaders are good at getting followers to challenge the process and to look and engage them into thinking of new ways, innovative ways, and being creative. The fourth characteristic is individualized consideration. And this is the leader's support and supportive actions toward followers. Transformational leadership is a two-way endeavor with two-way communication. Warren Bennis refers to it as the development of the capacity of your followers, which is a really big thing in the education world that Michael Fullen, who is one of the most important educational administration and leadership theorists, have advocated. Kouzes and Posner have their fourth and fifth components around this individualized consideration, and that's enabling others to act and challenging the heart. And so you can see it's really focused on the follower, focused on the development in some ways similar to the servant leadership approach that we talked about. And so, speaking of servant leadership and charisma and several other things, transformational leadership is very similar. In fact, one of the critiques we'll talk about of transformational leadership is the overlap and even confusion with several other elements of leadership. I think that's actually more of a positive, but let's look at some other approaches to leadership and distinguish how they're similar and different from transformational leadership. First of all, the idea of charismatic leadership. We haven't talked about this as a model because generally it's not a positive leadership model. Although transformational leadership shares many similar behaviors with charismatic leadership, the main difference is the extent to which charismatic leadership is really not as follower-directed. There's a lot more focus on the individual leader and their charisma. And of course, there are always challenges in charismatic leadership, potential challenges in the moral and ethical leadership of a charismatic leader. So charismatic leadership really serves the leader, while transformational leadership really serves followers and goals. Transactional leadership is another one that we haven't talked about because it's generally not a highly evolved form of leadership, although it is a very common form of leadership, a common model, very similar to social contract theory in the sense that it is a quid pro quo transaction, this for that. It really doesn't emphasize in the way transformational leadership emphasizes that inspired vision, the idea of change, and that notion of purpose. And so transformational leadership really takes that transactional approach, that transaction, and brings it to a higher plane. One of the most common forms of transactional leadership, aside from the things that we've talked about already within organizations, is politicians. They are often very transactional in the way they lead, thinking in terms of a simple exchange for votes, simple exchange for support, funding, whatever it might be. They view it a lot of times as a transaction. And then let's touch on two of the forms of leadership that we have talked about, and that's servant leadership first. Both types of leadership really leverage very strong ethical considerations. They also have very strong focus on followers and how important followers are in both of those models. Servant leaders really try almost exclusively to satisfy followers, where transformational leaders are typically more goal-focused, purpose-focused. In other words, they want to change for the sake of transforming and developing a vision. Servant leaders really are there to serve and there for the followers. And then lastly, let's compare to authentic leadership. There is an attempt, actually, authentic leadership is actually an attempt to go beyond the transformational leadership approach to the authenticity of the leader to help them become more transformative. So, authentic leadership and transformative leadership are very complementary approaches. In some cases, some transformational leaders fall prey to being seen as manipulative, not really concerned for people, but concerned for goals and processes and purpose. And so, authentic leadership and authentic transformational leadership is the attempt of that level of servant leadership authenticity, and at the same time being a little more focused on the goal than a servant leader might be. Let's touch on just a few other critiques. I mentioned the overlap and confusion with these other types of leadership styles and approaches. But let's talk a little bit about the dark side of transformational leadership, because there are significant connections to leadership and integrity of the transformational leader. It's really important for transformational leaders, and what distinguishes it really from charismatic leadership is the moral and ethical reasoning of the leader. because transformational leaders tend to build very strong bonds with their followers. Those bonds can be abused. And transformational leaders typically don't abuse those bonds, whereas a lot of times charismatic leaders do. So transformational leaders' core capacity for creating a vision and inspiring the members of an organization, still carries the potential for even the purpose to be unethical. And so, most of these negative associations are referred to as charismatic leadership, but there are a lot of transformational leaders that walk a very fine line between the manipulation of those followers and looking toward ends that are transformative, yet sometimes maybe unethical. And so you can see, for example, in the Jonestown Massacre, in the work of a lot of religious cult leaders, you can see similar kind of dark side of the transformational leader. In contrast, authentic transformational leadership focuses really on the collective good and the welfare of followers rather than self-interest. And so a lot of the dark side of transformational leadership can turn to self-interest. And so really it's a really significant approach in ethics and looking at transformational leadership and ethics, because the approach relies on ethical behaviors to inspire, motivate, and encourage people. And it's important that transformational leaders have that higher purpose and meaningful goals. It's important that they are engaged and very conversant in moral reasoning, some of the kind of ethical models that we've talked about. It's important that they build strong leader-follower relationships. Typically, charismatic leaders and the dark side of transformational leadership really do not focus on those leader-follower relationships. And it's also important to develop people and encourage them and provide them the support. So taking a page out of servant leadership. Most of the research, as I've said, it's a very research-heavy field. And the studies have shown that leaders who are seen as transformational tend to have a larger capacity for moral reasoning. They tend to pursue goals that are beyond their self-interest, and the perception of the leader's integrity are complementary, really, with the success of transformational leadership. So most transformational leadership is very successful, documented by research. Transformational leaders also have a tendency to be change agents, and so ethically that's important. Transformational leaders are better able to drive and manage change in organizations and focus on the development of people through that change. And of course, we'll see that front and center in the next segment when we talk about we talk about adaptive leadership. So let's lastly consider transformational leadership in the context of the 5 components, the process. The central focus of transformational leadership is the quality of the relationship between the leader and the follower working toward or together toward a common goal. So really it's a leader-follower goal process with transformational leadership, and it really truly is leadership as a process. Building relationships with followers, being ethical and engaging followers, and handling the challenges of change and the challenges of finding a goal. John McGregor Burns really said it best in that transformational leaders engage with followers in a mutual process of social influence in which both parties are positively changed and developed. And so the leader's role in developing others it makes this a very follower-focused approach. And probably from the ethical model that marries it the best is John Rawls' theory of justice and the notion of how you treat people, ethical treatment of people, and the notion of justice. So transformational leadership is an important leadership model for all of us really to understand and really be comfortable with utilizing and adopting as we provide leadership in our organizations.